Welcome to the Loft here in San Francisco. That is the city I think I'm in. It was foggy and rainy. Could be Seattle, but I think I'm in San Francisco. My name is Bill Reed, and I'm going to be kind of your presenter for the next couple hours. And then, but I'm going to kind of kick things off with just a little logistics about the Loft and getting you all set up so that you have a comfortable time here. First thing. If you have been trying to figure out how you get on the Wi-Fi, there's the Wi-Fi guest code, guest and password. If you need to go to the restroom, which hopefully you will at some point, there is a restroom code, 222#, and you go out and around. If you get lost, go to the front desk and they can direct you. This is a co-working space, so there will be people who are here co-working. There's an architect bar in the back, so if you're here and you have some sort of question that you'd like to dig into, we have solution architects who staff a bar in the back. So if you haven't been here before, just know that you can go back there and talk to them. All you need is an AWS account, which presumably you will all have by the close of this week, certainly by the close of today. And so there's lots of space here. If you need to go away and make phone calls, that sort of thing, feel free to do so. You can go kind of out here out the front door and hang out in the plaza. We are going to feed you, and we're going to give you coffee and water and pop and all that stuff. You can find that all in the back. Feel free to help yourself. Get up at any time, leave at any time. I'm going to presume that, you know, if you're thirsty, you're going to get a drink. So that's how we're going to work it. We're going to have a break. There'll be a couple different breaks throughout the day. Typically, what we do in these weeks is a combination of some talking, presenting, and a lot of hands-on stuff. So we're going to have you do exercises. We're going to have you get into the services. We're going to have you do workshops using our technologies, right? And you're going to do these simulating a number of different scenarios, interacting with the services. And so each of the days will be some component of hands-on. Usually it's about most of the afternoon. And so our intent is that you not just hear a bunch of presentations, but you actually get into using the services. So you can think about afternoons typically are going to be a couple hours of a hands-on workshop. You will need your laptops. You will need to be on Wi-Fi. And we'll be running through those. You'll have all the instructions you need to do that. We'll have people here to help you with those, regardless of your level of expertise. So some of you may be well-versed in all of the various services, and some of you, this might be a brand new thing. And that's awesome. And we're going to design it so that you can each have that kind of good experience from a learning perspective. The way it's going to work is today we're going to start with some intro. I'm going to ease you into it in a amuse-bouche of security. And then we're going to move into the afternoon a bit more on incident response and spend some time this afternoon on an exercise around incident response and some best practices in that space. And then tomorrow, you're going to spend a lot of time on threat detection and response. And so we are going to take you through some of the background of the services and best practice approaches. And then we're going to have you do a workshop that was a workshop that we delivered at reInvent last week. So if you happened to be at reInvent, you happened to be at the workshop, you can go do it again, or you can go have a nice long lunch. But we're going to do this workshop. It's going to get you using all of the various security services, in particular, our new security hub that we announced at reInvent. So that's tomorrow. On Wednesday, it's going to be what we call Identity Day. And we're going to go into our identity services, and we're going to spend a lot of time really making sure that you understand everything from roles and policy formation to multi-account management to organizations to single sign-on, federation, all of that sort of thing. So that's going to be on Wednesday. That's going to be a bit different in the sense that we're going to intersperse throughout the entire day hands-on. So it'll be some delivery, hands-on, delivery, hands-on, delivery, hands-on. Just a slight switch in the format there, but we find that it tends to work pretty well in the identity space. There's a lot to dive deep in that. On the last day, on Thursday, we're going to spend some time on automation and DevSecOps and looking at CI/CD pipeline and those processes with respect to security. And so we're going to have some, again, hands-on lab and some coverage on that day. Usually what people ask at the end of every day is, or you'll ask me probably in the break, can I get the slides? And you're welcome to take photos of all the slides and all that, but we will give you the slides in exchange for one favor, and we ask for feedback. We're going to send you a link asking for feedback. We actually really care about the feedback. We have made substantial changes throughout the year to the way we do these based on the feedback from the audience. And so it really helps inform us. We can't have lots of individual conversations with everybody, so we want to be able to gather it in a survey process. But if there's a comment that you want to make specifically, or you want a point known, feel free to find me or any of the other people that are leading workshops and let them know. We want this to be an experience that works for you. And so you can comment on everything. We love verbatims, so if there's something in particular that you would like to see that we didn't do, or that you were disappointed by, or that you really liked, feel free to put that in the verbatims as well. When we get those survey results, we'll distribute out the decks. But again, you can take photos and you can record, into your phone, all of these little things. And feel free to do that as we go along. But you don't have to. You'll get the decks. So with that, are we good to go? Okay. So I'm going to start, I'll briefly introduce myself. So I lead our North American solution architecture, security, and compliance practice. So we're solution architects at Amazon. We work with customers directly in helping them think about architectural considerations with respect to a variety of different services. My team specifically looks at security and compliance concerns. My team's spread out all over the country, and we work with customers of all sizes as long as they're in the commercial space. So we don't tend to work with government contractors or government services, things that run in GovCloud. We have a team of people that we partner with who are also solution architects, but they specialize in that. So that's what we do. I'm based out of Seattle, but I spend a lot of time all over the country. When I say North America, we also do quite a bit of work in Canada. So we'll go up and do a variety of different things with different institutions in the Canadian market as well. And so that means that we have to pay attention to PIPEDA and other types of compliance law and rule that happens to be in those geos. So what we're going to do is I'm going to ask, so I came to here from doing a couple different stints as a CISO and some software companies. And we're regulated healthcare software companies. And one of the things that I always found particularly challenging for me, and the things that basically scared the crap out of me every day, were really these two things. It made my job really, really hard. The first was, I frankly didn't know. Scary. But I was always constantly in the pursuit of trying to understand what assets we had, who was using services, what was going on in those environments, whether the backups, patch status, all of that stuff was very difficult to know. In part, I was doing, the first time I did this, we were in a colo facility with our own hardware and software, licensed software. And we were operating that inside a colo space. So I had access to smart hands, I had power, redundancy, that sort of thing, but I owned everything. And it was really difficult. Most of what I spent a lot of time with, when I asked people to give me, an inventory, they would give me hardware inventory. And I'd say, no, well, I really want an inventory of everything. I want an inventory of all the activity. That's what I really care about. And it was really hard. So going through any kind of SOC 2 compliance effort was challenging because I had to gather up a whole bunch of stuff and prep for those audits and fill in a lot of gaps. The second was there was almost no automation. So what that meant is that if we had a CVE and we needed to go and execute patch management against our environments, one of the big challenges that we had was we now needed to figure out which staff were going to be available during our lights out period on a Saturday night at 2 a.m. to implement the patch process. We'd plan the whole thing, and we'd hope it worked. If it didn't, we did a rollback, and then we did another scheduled update. And it really required people logging into boxes and updating software. And it was a challenge, right? It made us move much slower than I would like to, and it meant also that we had to disrupt the customer's experience. We had to let everybody know through our customer service teams that we were going to have lights out on Saturday at 2 a.m. to 6 a.m., and then we're going to bring the service back up and running. It sort of worked in our business, but really, it would have been better to have avoided that. So those are really some real challenges, and I think those challenges persist. And so those are challenges that we often go after with respect to the AWS platform, and that you're going to see some themes about this because we've done a lot of effort in going after these types of challenges because they really are a plague on our ability to secure our environments and to do our jobs. And so instead of having kind of this challenge of, well, I could move fast, right? Security is generally often seen as a blocking service inside a company. Right? The reason why we can't do things is because InfoSec told us we can't do things. Right? Or it didn't meet our compliance checklist, so we can't move forward with the purchase. Generally, security is seen as a gate on innovation. People want to move quickly, and security is a barrier in that. And what we're really trying to do is take that notion, that construct that's evolved, unfortunately, and really change it into something where we're actually able to move quickly. Like, it's just part of the normal process. It's subject to the same automation, it's subject to the same activities, it's built into the normal processes that you would expect with any set of services. Shouldn't be a gating function. We want it to be part of the design construct. That's why you're going to hear us refer to things like DevSecOps, because we really want security to be part of the normal DevOps process, subject to the same automations, built into the same pipelines. And you'll experience that throughout this week. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the things about what we try to do with our service. The first is, when you build something into our platform or on our platform, what we want you to do is be able to inherit a global set of controls. So if we make a change in a service based on customer feedback, it's not just that customer gets the advantage of that capability or that innovation. Everybody does. And so we try to roll out things as globally as we can. In some cases, there's a natural gate in terms of rolling services out across all the regions, but our intent is get them out across all the regions and make it so that it's inherently usable by everybody. So we want the benefit of innovations done for any individual client to benefit everybody. It's just kind of part of, frankly, it's an efficient way to do it, but it's also what we want you all to be able to have. So if we go out and do, let's say, certify a service for PCI DSS compliance, we want anybody who needs PCI DSS compliance to be able to take advantage of that audit or certification process. The second is that we design things for scale. Yep.
So GDPR?
Yep. 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 Yeah, we actually have a site. The question was, what about, is that apply to GDPR and other types of law? And the answer is yes. So we have a compliance organization, broadly corporate compliance organization that looks across all of those. If you haven't seen, we have a GDPR sub-site on our compliance page where you can see updates as we're going through that, what's happening with respect to customers' experiences with respect to GDPR. And again, GDPR really is frankly having a global impact. There's a lot of US businesses that do business with people who are residents inside the European Union, inside the countries that are covered underneath that law. And so it's important. What's also going to be important as we go forward will be CCPA. You happen to sit in California, right? And if you look at what happened in California, it's frankly very influenced by what happened with GDPR. And so as we move forward in implementation, you'll see us look at how we give guidance with respect to that, the implementation of that law. So if you don't know what CCPA is, it's the Consumer Privacy Act for California. It comes into effect in 2020, and it behaves a lot like GDPR with little subtle twists. So encourage you to learn about it, because it's going to definitely be impactful for, frankly, everybody, certainly in the United States, not just California. But we try to scale. We try to do things for scale. We want you to not lose the controls and the ability to manage the environment as you scale out. So a lot of what you'll see from an innovation perspective in a lot of our services is we try to make sure that those services and those controls allow for scale. But scale also applies to scale in, because I might want to scale something in because if I don't have a service that needs to be used, one, I save money, but two, I reduce the attack surface area. So if I don't have to have compute exposed or a service exposed, I can reduce that surface area if I can also scale in. We spend a lot of time looking at privacy and data security and looking at privacy and data security law and various requirements. We have lots of governments that impose a lot of requirements on us. We have a lot of customers and commercial customers that impose a set of different industry compliance obligations on us. We spend a lot of time looking at that and making sure, again, that we can get control coverage. One of the things I'll talk about a little bit later, I'll just give you a quick preview, is that we used to, in many cases, there'd be a little bit of a lag. We'd release a service, and then to some frustration, there would be a little bit of a lag before we brought it under a compliance coverage. Right? So you'd see a service release, and then you go to services and scope on our compliance page. It'd be a little bit of a lag. What we're doing now is we're moving that up so that when we release services, we released a number of them just last week, 2 weeks ago, and we released them with the compliance coverage in place already. So we've been doing some work to try to collapse that, because we know that people want to use those services. And so to the degree that we can complete that compliance activity as just a normal part of the release process, we're doing so. We spent a lot of time also on thinking about how we can integrate it with security, automation, security services capability. A key example of that would be something like our key management service, broadly trying to integrate into a lot of different services, or CloudTrail or CloudWatch. And then the other is that we have a lot of security partners, and we love our security partners. We have in our AWS marketplace, if you go and sort on security, there's close to 400 different security offerings in the marketplace. And these are instance-based services that you can consume. So everything from vulnerability scanners to hardened AMIs, a whole bunch of different sets of services that are available to you. And you can go out there and get those. Some of the vulnerability scans, for example, will take care of the notification to us that you're going to be doing vulnerability scanning activity in your account, which saves you the hassle of having to do that reporting. I get a lot of questions from customers about our data centers. And you can actually go to this link here, and you can take a virtual tour of our data centers. But a lot of times, I'll get a question like, and I'll get it on third-party audits, audit reports, can I tour your data center? Why can't we tour the data center? And if we had like 4 customers, we could probably do that. We just can't do it with millions of customers. One, just imagine the logistics of that. 1 million people going through a single data center, let alone all of the data centers. Everyone needing to be escorted, everyone spending hours, and all around, all those people who you don't know around your instances. Probably not a thing we should be doing, right? Just doesn't work at scale. So it's often, well, you must be, why aren't you letting us see your data centers? It just can't, logistically, we can't work. We can't make it possible for that number of people to go through. What we can do, though, is tell you as much as we can about our environments and give you all the third-party audit reports. And so we're trying to do more and more with kind of exposure of the audit process But we take our data centers through third-party audit and certification processes, whether it's for our SOC 2 reports or whether it's for our ISO certs. We engage with those third parties. They come in, they do reports, and we make those available to you in our service we call AWS Artifact that you can get access to from the console. You can go in there and see all the various certifications, attestations. You can request the SOC 2 Type 2 reports all through that process. But typically, let's take kind of a quick look at kind of the physical and other types of process security we do in our data centers. The first is, like all security, there's multi-layers, right? So you always want to come at security from a layered perspective because nothing is perfect, and therefore you reduce the probability of an event when you introduce multiple overlapping layers. It allows for mitigation of risk. So the first is physical access controls. So somebody will say to me, well, can you tell me the address of all your data centers? We don't. We just want to make it a little bit harder. It's just work factor, right? The second is that you got to have, classic perimeter security guards, gates, and guns. So you got to have people on the perimeter. You have to have fencing. You have to have lights. You have to have monitoring. We do all of that, just like you would see in any kind of standard state-of-the-art data center. Then when we get into the environment, you can't get to the environment without passing through multi-MFAs. So we think about, they're basically in any kind of good perimeter security or layered security model, you'll man-trap the space as you walk through. So you're stuck, you got to get through one spot, then you get in, now you got to pass through another MFA to get to the next spot. It allows for some isolation and, again, slowing traversal across the data center. If somebody sold a cred, they didn't steal both creds. The probability of that is very high or very low. The second is then within the data layer, lots of protection there in terms of thinking about how we do isolation, so logical isolation. And so we do a bit of that, as well as encryption on services. And then often also people will ask about what's the process for destruction. And so we follow NIST guidelines for the destruction of drives, for overwrites on memory space, on block storage, on you name it. We have a series of procedures that we follow, again, in conformance with what all of the various certification processes ask us to do. And then there's kind of another risk that we spend time mitigating, and that is energy. So energy risk and availability of energy is also part of the matrix here, which is how is it that we think about maintaining availability. And one of that is, well, we have geographic distribution of data centers on a regional basis, so that we're a country to lose power, access to power through some sort of attack. There's the ability to have other operations in other environments. So we mitigate risk through that kind of global posture. The other is that we have multiple availability zones that are designed to kind of manage this very careful balance between latency and between physical security risk. So availability zones are a construct. If you're not familiar, it's a construct within our regional model. We describe regions as groups of they sit in a geography, and they consist of groups of availability zones, which are data centers. And they're spread just far enough to allow for low latency traffic between them so that you can have some isolation. But they're also physically isolated in terms of different floodplains and exposed to different risks from a geological and weather perspective. So we look carefully at that, try to manage that. But we're also looking at alternative energy sources. Can we be producing energy that provides the power for our data centers? And whether that's wind, solar, hydro, other types of power sources. So we're less potentially dependent on a national grid. And again, if we can do that with renewable resources, we'll do so. For those of you that didn't notice in the last couple days, like the price of oil just shot up, right? So those all become costs that you have to mitigate when you're running data centers that require like refueling generators at scale. And so these are just a number of the different compliance and certification programs that we go through. Again, these kind of evolve as one, law changes, industry regs change, and customers ask us. So if a customer comes to us and says, you know what, I can't do this workload unless you achieve this particular compliance obligation, then we will look at that and we'll evaluate it and try to figure out how broadly can we do that.
On the previous slides,
Yeah.
a line that said measuring simulating service disruptions, measuring our response. Here's what are some of the measures, like time recovery, that sort of thing.
Yeah, RTO, RPOs on our disaster recovery plans, bringing environments up. It's really how long would it take to try to restore an entire AZ, those sorts of things. Yep. So these are all, some of these may or may not apply to you, but we cover a broad swath because we have a lot of customers in a lot of different industries, so we have to get fairly decent coverage. On the privacy is increasingly important. I think there was a watershed year this year with respect to privacy law on a global basis. If you think that California was unusual, there was a new privacy law passed in Brazil, in India, in Russia, and a number of other countries. So privacy law is a fact. It will increasingly become important for organizations in terms of how data is managed and the disclosure and access requirements for individual consumers. And California is a leading state on that. It probably will strongly influence whatever happens on a national basis. But my guess is that we're not going to see less privacy law over time. We'll probably see more. And it might get confusing for a little bit, like it did in Europe for a while. But we want to allow you to meet the data residency requirements and control requirements of the various laws. So that's why we have a regional structure. That's why we put a data center in Frankfurt. That's why we have European data centers. That's why we have geographical spreads so that we can allow you to keep data where it needs to be and allow you to move it when you need to move it. And it's your choice. We're not going to move your data for you. So you decide where you want to put it. We'll give you lots of different regions, and you can set it up however you need it. The other is encryption. We spent a lot of time. Werner Vogels, who CTO, has this famous keynote that he does at reInvent every year. Last year, he talked about encrypt everything. Well, we want you to do as much encryption as you can. And we want to try to make it easy for you, but we also want to allow you to do the encryption that you need to do and the model you need to do that fits your risk appetite and the legal requirements that you have laid down by your customers. So if your customers say that you must have a dedicated HSM, we'll give you a dedicated HSM. You can do that through one service called Cloud HSM. If you don't want to do the key management process, and you don't want to provide the key material, you can use KMS and we'll provide the key material for you. You want to bring your own key material, but use KMS, we'll let you do that as well. So we want to allow you to do encryption at scale, both on endpoints as well as at data on rest. And then increasingly, you'll find that while it's not encryption, a lot of people are using private link and staying out of internet and staying in private fiber. So that's also happening. We allow for you, we want to make sure that people comply with that and compliant architecture, so we've kind of reviewed all that. A lot of partners. And what partners do is, in most cases, they provide way more functionality and specificity than we're going to do on a service. And there's simply areas where it doesn't make sense for us to provide that service. And the other thing that's nice about this coverage is that if you're already familiar with a set of tools that you use on-prem or in another cloud environment, they're familiar tools, familiar interfaces. We don't want to have you take on a new training burden just because you take on a new cloud environment or you take on a new compute space. So if you're used to using Symantec or Trend or Dome 9 or Alien Vault, whatever that is, we want you to have that familiarity. The other is that we have a variety of different consulting partners that work across the space of different scales that are used to working with SMBs all the way up to large enterprises and global companies. And they have certified teams of AWS engineers that can go out and help you do these projects. So as people are trying to tackle and figure out what they need to do, you don't need to use necessarily an AWS ProServe service. You can use lots of different partners, and that allows us to get some scale and provide that capability. So again, a lot of it is about scaling, and scaling not by being blinded to what's happening in the environments and not losing control as you do that scaling. And so what you've seen over the last couple of years is a lot of service kind of expansion and introduction that's designed around that set of capabilities so that you can start managing multi-accounts. You can start having service control policies inside organizations. You can and we'll talk a little bit about making transiting easier and with on-prem services. So it's all built essentially around that model. So if you want to try to figure out where's AWS going, it's going to be really around how do we help scale out environments, scale down environments, and have visibility into what's happening. And particularly on the security front, everything that we're doing is around increasing that visibility. And it's not just making more logs, but it's making sense of those logs and interpreting them in the context of your environments and what's happening in the threat landscape. So we do a fair amount of that. So I want to walk through a concept that is pretty important to us, and I'm going to kind of give you some kind of an insight that I see. Yeah.
So, in context of security at times, you mentioned the wolf accounts. I may want to have a specific service be in a dedicated security policy.
Yep.
I know right now we have to look at kind of tying the shared responsibility model of transfer services between accounts on my own. Where AWS going, do you know if they'll be easier to transfer services between accounts for security purposes or not? That's just sort of out of the ballpark.
Yeah. No, so the question was just, hey, if I want to have services in one account, I want to have them in a different account. And one of the things that we'll spend some time on Wednesday, on Identity Day, is cross-account roles and accessing services and granting role-based access for services and individuals to various services across accounts. We'll talk about one thing that we announced at reInvent later in the next section of this morning. But yes. Yep. But the shared responsibility model comes up often because what happens is I get a lot of third-party risk assessment questionnaires. And a third-party risk assessment questionnaire, maybe some of you have put these together, some of you may have answered these. They come in this thing called Excel, usually. There's been various attempts at online services, but most of the time it comes in a really honking big spreadsheet. And they're really kind of roughly similar in terms of the questions that are being asked. And there's a huge number of them, and there's usually no time to answer them. So that's the general characteristic. Because what tends to happen is all the process moves along, and then at the end stage, somebody goes, wait, did we talk to procurement about whether we can do this? And then somebody goes, yeah, well, I don't know. We should call procurement. And then they call up procurement, and the procurement person says, well, hey, we have a third-party risk assessment process you got to go through before you can buy stuff. And And then everybody goes, oh, crap. And they rush out and try to find what that is and put it together, and then off it goes with great urgency. I'd love to say that I didn't get one of those emails this morning, but I can't. In fact, I did. So most of the time, when these questionnaires come in, the questions have a structure. And that structure assumes one of two things. Either everything is an on-prem physical environment, physically controlled environment. So this is the class of questionnaires that I look at as they've never been updated. This is the exact same third-party risk questionnaire that they've been using for a long time that represents an on-prem purchase and deployment of a full stack. The second type is the questions come in and they assume an entire SaaS-based model that only thing I give you is an URL, and everything else we're operating. And unfortunately, those aren't really the majority of the models that exist today. It's much more varied. And when you think about infrastructure as a service, which AWS provides a lot of, right? Infrastructure as a service assumes a hybrid model. And not just hybrid meaning on-prem, off-prem, but hybrid in terms of who's responsible for what types of services and what gets deployed in the environment. And so it becomes important to understand that, because it becomes important not just for filling out questionnaires, but for thinking about how I apply controls and what's being done in that environment to control that and maintain those environments. And so it's important to understand, with respect to services, what you're responsible for. We're going to talk about that, because one of the things that this is a pretty foundational concept for us with respect to security, and you'll see it as we go through the rest of the week and we're looking at different services. So the first thing we talk about is security of the cloud. And so security of the cloud is like all the stuff that you saw about perimeter security and the data isolation and virtualization and things above the below the hypervisor. That part of the environment we take ownership and responsibility for. We're not going to ask our customers to volunteer to cover an hour at one of our guard stations at a data center, right? We're going to take care of doing that, right? We're going to take care of all of the hiring and the vetting and the processing and the permissioning of that. But we have this other construct, which is security in the cloud. And so what we do is we assume that what you're going to store in the AWS environment is the most precious of your resources and the most valued workloads that you possibly could run. That's our default posture. We don't come in and assume, it's just dev environments and they're playing around with dummy data. Our default risk posture with respect to you is that you're running the most valuable workloads with the most sensitive data. Stop, right? And that's how we approach it. So we don't know what you're doing in your account because we assume that it's not our business. So we don't look at your data. We don't manage your permissions. We don't decide who gets access to your account. We don't even have humans updating our fleet. It's done automated. The people who walk our floors in our data centers don't have logical access to the machines that they're walking next to. Couldn't log on to them if they needed to. It's not possible. Somebody else has to do that. Right? So somebody who's running cable can't log into the machine. They need somebody else who has logical access. The person with logical access is never allowed inside that data center. We'll never have it. So that in the cloud space is something that we reserve for you all, and we'll walk through what some of those controls are in terms of what you do. And it's gotten interesting. And we'll talk a little bit about what I mean by that. The first is this is a traditional security model, right? You own responsibility for everything. The pallet shows up, and on it is all of this stuff. And you own the building, and you staff the guards, gates, and guns, and you put the cameras in, and you do all that stuff. You hire up your security teams, and you run the whole environment, right? That's a traditional security model, right? On-prem. And and if you did like a colo, maybe this part gets done by somebody else, right? Because they're running the power lines in and the IP. But outside of that, you have responsibility for it. Again, your hardware, your OS, your virtualization, you do it. Then this is our infrastructure as a service model, right? We take care of the global infrastructure. So we take care of putting in edge locations for content distribution, DNS resolving, right? We put in the availability zones inside regions. We run that on a global basis, right? We do the fiber between things, all of us. Then we make a bunch of foundational services available for you. So we make EC2 available for you, right? So you can have AMIs and deploy those on whatever OS you want. We make storage environments available for you, whether that's storage on the instance or it's EBS or it's S3. We make database services available for you, right? Could be you want to have basic RDS instances. Networking capabilities, we provide that, right? So VPCs, security groups, ACLs, subnets, all of that. We provide the infrastructure for that. We don't configure it for you, but we give you the capability for doing all of that. Everything else above that, you don't responsibility for. So what that means is that if you have an environment where you're running, let's say, SQL Server on a Windows instance in EC2, who's responsible for the patching? Any guesses? Who takes care of the patching of that Windows box? The customer does, right? We would take responsibility for the patching of the hypervisor and of the core OSs underlying the infrastructure, of the routers, the switches, everything that makes that service available. But the core operating system in that case and the SQL Server instance installed there would be responsibility of the customer to manage the management and patching of that service. So unless explicitly described as a managed service, that would be the responsibility of the customer to do that. So you might run a management agent on that to manage that updates. And you'd monitor Microsoft Patch Tuesdays, and you'd be thinking about what you needed to do on that instance and dealing with CVEs. Does that make sense? I want to pause here for a sec. It's okay to not make sense. Happy to explain it more differently. Okay. Some of you might be really basic. I apologize. Super good concept, though, to nail down. Okay. So then what happens is, then we start introducing other services. Because we have some customers that say, well, you know what, I don't want to do all that stuff. I don't want to do all that. So they say, can't you guys just do that management stuff and that patching? And like, we don't want you to put the data in our databases, but geez, we really don't want to run the databases. We don't want to update the database. We don't want to update the stack, right? That's just not, it's just not what we want to do in our business. We can't afford to do that and staff for that. So we don't want to do that. So then what ends up happening is we take on additional services. Our responsibility steps up. So if you think about a service like RDS, we now step up and own the core OS and the database, and we run that on whatever flavor of relational database you're using. Right? If you do something like DynamoDB, we step up even further, and we run that infrastructure, but you own how you're going to deploy tables and what you put in those tables. Right? If you use Lambda, we're going to run the environment around it, but we don't dictate or control the code execution that you have. And the same thing goes for managed container services. So you could run Kubernetes in EC2. Could absolutely run a Kubernetes instance in EC2 and set it up and run it. Or you could use EKS and have us take on some of the management of that and run it in that environment. Or you could just say, well, I'm just going to use lambdas and step functions and let you guys manage a bunch of that. I'm just not even going to worry about that. And we did that because customers have different needs. And so they've asked us to go in a number of different directions. Some still want to have very tight control over the entire stack. That's why we still have bare metal instances. We, in fact, just made an announcement at reInvent that we have a new service called Outpost. Anybody hear about Outpost? Yeah, so very few people heard. So Outpost is an Amazon server. Like, you can have it and run it. Like, so if you think about, some customers said, well, you know, I need some workloads to be on-prem. I can't have it any other way. But I don't want to learn a bunch of new tools, and I don't want to deal with that. So, but I can't. It's just not going to ever be an acceptable risk. So we've done things like Snowball at the Edge, which is a storage device with compute on board to allow you to do compute inside a secure container. Right? So we've gone all the way down the stack to give people the ability to have physical control of resources, all the way up to the stack to give people the ability to do nothing but code. And it really depends on what it is that your business needs and what you can take from a risk appetite and a compliance obligation. We tend to work carefully with a lot of the organizations that are doing compliance work to help them understand what's behind all of that and the controls. And typically, if we can give people an understanding of the control infrastructure and the mitigations that are available for those controls, they tend to get comfortable with it over time. But
Where do the load balancers sit?
so the load balancers typically are networking aspects. So NLB, ALBs, that sort of thing. We're managing those, but we don't know where you want the loads to be balanced or how you want it to be configured. Do you want it to be geographically based load balancing and direction or not, right? So things like, you know, we'll make services like an encryption service available to you, so our job is to make the service be integrated and secure and operational and hardware backed and have all the management capabilities on it, an API or more APIs to allow you to integrate with it, the ability to monitor it with CloudTrail. But we will give you then the option of whether you want to bring your own key material or not. And depending on that, when you bring key material in, you take on some key management responsibilities, right? So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, what percentage of customers use platform as a service and infrastructure as a service simultaneously? I mean, you talked about a hybrid version. That's
Yeah.
not a hybrid dimension.
Yeah, that's another hybrid dimension. So hybrid isn't just on-prem, off-prem. The question was, what percentage of our customers do both at the same time? And it's actually increasingly the case, right? Because you might do something like, I'm going to use lambdas for automation on services in my EC2 environment. So I want to have lambdas execute a particular response to a particular trigger on what's going on in my EC2 environment, right? And so there's a balance in terms of controls by service.
I thought that would be
Yeah,
common.
it's common.
I mean, you always see these slides as separate, and it's really not.
It's not. So we abstract it to some degree, or else it would be super hard to explain, right? But it is an important construct. So when you're looking at different services, if you see a service and we say it's a managed service, that typically means that we're taking on some additional responsibilities beyond just the compute foundational service level. Okay? But then we have allowed people to dip down into bare metal, where you can have a bare metal service or dedicated host, and you have more control, right? And so you take on more control, and with that, we do less management of that environment, slightly less. Still don't have to put your own guard outside the droplet, but okay. Does that make sense? It's kind of a nuanced concept. But it's important because kind of the compute models are less black and white than I think they've probably ever been. And so, as we're going through, yeah. Yeah, so we spend a fair amount of time evaluating where we want to bring regions in. Often, it's going to be driven based on capacity, where we need additional compute capacity, or where we think there needs to be, there's going to be a legally driven reason, right? Where there's a boundary. So let's say, for example, a presumption is, for example, that Brexit happens, right? And so then there's a question out there on the table right now with respect to the UK about equivalency and whether they achieve what's considered to be equivalency with the rest of the EU. So right now they're in the EU, right? So they get to share data within the EU. When you step outside the EU has a law that says you must show equivalency in order to be able to share. Otherwise, you have to have some other mechanism. Well, what happens when the UK steps out? Well, now they have to prove equivalency. How long that process takes? It's probably going to be after Brexit happens. Who knows, right? So we look at that and we want to make sure that we can accommodate our customers in any situation where we would expect there to be those types of challenges. And again, where we need capacity. So growing use, additional services, and coverage. So it's, as you can imagine, it's a pretty expensive proposition to bring up a data center or a region, actually, multiple data centers, and staff that up. So it's a very carefully thought through process. But we will be bringing more up. Yeah, sometimes we announce them in advance, and it kind of depends on how certain we are about making the commitment to that. Okay. Any other questions on this? So I'm going to kind of wrap up on this slide. So we use a couple different models and frameworks to kind of help organize services. You'll notice that this week we've got some themes around some different things. We tend to look at, there's a set of controls and services that are really identity-based. They're used for managing identities. They're used for managing permissioned access to resources. And so that falls under this identity category. I tend to think of these as directive controls. They're controls that you put in place to direct an action. Like if I build a policy, I'm trying to direct behavior. If I put in organizations with a service control policy, I'm directing the behavior that I want to have happen. And so we tend to think of identity as directive controls. They're directing a behavior of how we want that environment to behave and principles and services within that environment, whether it's on a permanent basis or a temporary basis. So that's a lot of what you're going to dive into on Wednesday in that space. Organizations being a big part of that as well, but we also, increasing use of Cognito as a service as well. But you'll hear some about that and Secrets Manager, et cetera. On the detective controls, remember I said that one of the big challenges classically in security is visibility. So we have a lot on the detective controls. We've been adding a lot into this space. It really started with CloudTrail. Remember, CloudTrail used to be an optional service, like turn it on optionally. We would say to everybody, hey, you should turn it on. So then we decided, well, maybe we should turn it on for you. But CloudTrail is the service that allows you to know what activity is going on across the APIs. So think of it as a trail of API actions that allows you to understand the interactions going on with the various services you've deployed. Very important from a management perspective, very critical from a security perspective about whether the behaviors are hacked accordingly. We introduced a new service called Security Hub. That's going to be some work that you're going to do tomorrow, diving deeper into that. I'm going to do a little bit more depth on that in a minute, next hour. So I'm just going to say that that falls under that, and we'll talk more about how that wraps that up. On an infrastructure security basis, really the foundation of all of this is VPCs, virtual private cloud. So think about that is the logical security isolation boundary for activity. That's in which you put security groups, in which you put subnetting. It's really think about it as a critical network control, essentially a virtual firewall in that respect. Data protection, really the kind of the big piece in that whole category of data protection is KMS. It's the most integrated of the services. We'll talk about an announcement we made with respect to the relationship of Cloud HSM and KMS for key management. But that's all about data protection and encryption, but we also have certificate manager and SSL, TLS, endpoint security wrapped in that space. And then the last thing is incident response. You're going to spend some more time on incident response and looking at various tools later today. But there's a couple services that are helpful in that process, but a lot of the incident response we're going to talk about from just how you think about it and organize your efforts around that. So some of that is a little less tool-based and probably more process-based. But the tools certainly play a part in that. I will say that the incident response piece is an area that when we do well-architected reviews with our customers, it's one of the areas that customers typically have the most challenge with. It's not fun to think about what you're going to do when bad things happen. And it tends to not be things you buy. It's things you need to do and organize. And it's hard to do if you don't practice. And a lot of people don't practice. But practicing is fun, and you'll learn how fun it is to practice because you're going to do some. A little foreshadowing there. And with that, I'm going to wrap up this hour. I'm going to let you take a little break.